The man who is supposed to be running Iran, not politically, literally, Mojtaba Khamenei, appointed as Iran's third supreme leader just weeks ago, is lying in intensive care to Tehran hospital, unaware of his own appointment, unaware of the crisis consuming his country, unaware that the regime he was chosen to lead is tearing itself apart in the corridors above him. Something has begun that no one in Washington, Beijing, or Moscow fully anticipated. Secret itself, Iran's own president just publicly demanded that Hormuz be opened. Strait was open to all commercial vessels, and on the same day that announcement was made, the IRGC opened fire on tankers. The same regime, the same day, the same regime, at just two completely opposite orders. The minister stupid in public on air. What is happening inside Iran right now is not, it has ceased to function as a single entity. Three factions that teach three agendas. Three factions, three agendas, three sets of orders being issued simultaneously from the same chain of command. And above all of them, the man who was supposed to make final decisions cannot open his eyes. This is the moment everything converges. The blockade outside, the collapse inside, the deadline tomorrow, and four men who have hated each other since 1988, now fighting for control of a nuclear-armed state with the whole world watching. Stay with me, because what is breaking in Tehran right now is more dangerous and more consequential than anything happening on the surface of the Strait of Hormuz. To understand the depth of what is fracturing, you need to understand what Iran looked like before the collapse began. The Islamic Republic's power structure was always complex. It was always built around competing centers of authority: the presidency, the parliament, the guardian council, each with its own institutional interests and its own interpretation of the revolution's mandate. But that complexity was accidentally managed by one thing: the unquestioned supremacy of the Supreme Leader's office as the final arbiter of every significant decision. Ali Khamenei held that office for more than 3 decades. Whatever the internal tensions that simmered beneath his presence at the apex of the system created a gravitational center around which everything else organized itself. When factions clashed, there was a court of last resort. When competing agendas threatened to spiral into open conflict, there was a figure capable of imposing a resolution. On joint U.S.-Israeli strike was gone. Zaire Israeli strike eliminator Armed Forces Chief Mousavi, Defense Minister Nasserzadeh, and 48 senior officials simultaneously. The command architecture of the Islamic Republic, built over 45 years single ideological hierarchy, was decapitated in a sunk operation. Appointed as the Fontlis Ali's sons, was appointed as the third supreme leader on March 9th. He was meant to provide continuity to fill the vacuum before it could be exploited. To give the remaining factions a new gravitational to organize around, he went into a coma vacuum, possessing nuclear after the appointment. The control room of a possessing nuclear capabilities was left empty, and 4 men raised in the same IRGC barracks in the 1980s, carrying 4 decades of accumulated grievances and competing ambitions toward each other, moved into the vacuum simultaneously. Their names are Vahidi, Ghalibaf, Zolgadar, and Rezaei. And understanding who they are is essential to understanding why Iran cannot currently speak with a single voice. Ahmad Vahidi is the most dangerous name on that list. He commanded the Quds force from 1988 to 1990 before Soleimani. He has a personal operational history that stretches from Lebanon to responsibility for the 1994 bombing of the Buenos Aires Jewish Community Center that killed 85 people. He carries an Interpol notice and that has Fall Argentina that followed him for 3 decades. Vahidi was appointed as IRGC commander on March 1st. His worldview is not complicated. The war must continue. The Strait of the United States must be rejected. For Vahidi, every one of those positions is not just ideologically correct, but institutionally necessary. Because here is the reality that drives every calculation he makes, and claim to institutional relevance all depend on the existence of active conflict. In a war, the IRGC is indispensable. In peace, the IRGC's massive budget becomes a political question. Its proxy networks become liabilities, becomes an obstacle, and a reason for existence gets questioned. Its entire reason for existence gets questioned by a population that is hungry and exhausted and has been told for 4 years that sacrifice victories that never fully materialized. For Vahidi, peace is not an option. It is an existential threat to everything he commands. Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf sits at the opposite end of the practical spectrum. Though not as parliament speaker, and head of the Islamabad negotiations delegation, Ghalibaf has arrived at a conclusion that Vahidi treats as betrayal. The economic reality is unsurvivable. Iran is absorbing $270 billion in war damage. Infrastructure has been shattered from Isfahan's industrial zones to the port facilities at Bushehr and Bandar Abbas. The storage tanks are full. The oil wells are approaching the point of forced shutdown. Ghalibaf is not a reformist. He's not pro-American. He's not ideologically distant from the revolution that served for 4 years the system. He's a regime survivor, calculating that the only path to regime survival runs through and a deal that stops the bleeding before there is nothing left to save. The distinction Ghalibaf himself might resist, but that analysts watching him understand clearly is this. He appears to be taking the people's side. He's actually trying to save the regime by positioning it alongside the people's demons rather than against them. The direction is the same as what Iranians want. The motivation is preservation, not transformation. Foreign Minister İrgc sits alongside Ghalibaf in the negotiating camp, publicly announcing on April 17th that Hormuz was open to commercial vessels, attempting to signal to international partners that Iran was moving toward de-escalation. He was publicly called stupid by his own military's media, and Pezeshkian, the reformist president who was elected on a platform of economic relief and diplomatic engagement, dropped a statement on April 20th that landed inside the regime like a detonation. If the conflict continues, Iran faces a massive reconstruction crisis. Infrastructure, no funding, no market stability. The people must be told the truth. Trust in government eroding was a public acknowledgement. This was not a polishment that the war's cost to the Iranian people has become unsurvivable and that the regime's survival instinct must override the IRGC's war instinct. For the hardliners, it was a declaration of surrender. For the people, it was the first honest statement from inside the regime in years. Here is what makes them explosive than any previous Iranian internal dispute. For the first time since the revolution, a faction of the regime is saying what the people have been saying for years. And the people's patience ran out a long time ago. Iran's Luke claimed that 87% of Iranians support continuing the war. The host and expert delivered this figure with absolute conviction. No polling organization was named, no methodology was described, no DRIA source was cited. The 87% was presented as established fact in the way that only features invented for political purposes can be delivered with total confidence. The reality measured by the independent Gamonri 30,000 participants is the precise opposite of the propaganda. 63% of Iranians say the regime and Israel and has nothing to do with the people. 44% hold the regime directly responsible for the country's condition. 50% rate the regime's performance negatively. The majority want peace, economic relief, and structural change. The distance between war support and 63% regime non-identification is not a polling discrepancy. It is the measurement of a regime that has lost contact with the population it claims to represent. It is the gap between what the IRGC needs, people to believe in what people actually believe. And that gap has been since Mahsa Amini's death in 2022, set off protest waves that it nearly destabilized the entire system. Gamon's trend data shows something even more significant than the current snapshot. Inside, Iran is accelerating toward regime change. Not revolution, necessarily, not organized opposition, necessarily, but a sustained erosion of the regime's perceived legitimacy that is approaching the point where it can no longer be managed by propaganda alone. Ghalibaf and Pezeshkian understand this. Their shift toward the people's position is not ideological conversion. It is the political equivalent of a building engineer watching the foundation crack and recommending evacuation before the structure's on everyone's eyes. Because Vahidar does not see this, does not include regime survival as a terminal value. It includes IRGC survival. And those are not the same thing. Into this fractured internal landscape, two developments are arriving, every pressure toward a breaking point. The first is the Hormuz Trap closing, tighter by the day. Before the U.S. Tehran was exporting 1,850,000 barrels of oil per day, almost entirely to China, generating approximately $150 million in daily revenue. That revenue funded soldier financing the upper-range financial architecture through proxy the which the Islamic Republic projected power across the region. More precisely, it is negative because the oil being produced has nowhere to go. Storage capacity is filling. Pressure in the pipelines behind the storage is building to the dangerous levels, and according to reporting by Reuters, Iran has a window of 10 to 15 days before it must begin shutting down oil wells entirely. Oil well shutdown is not a reversible decision made at a committee meeting. It is a geological event with permanent consequences. When underground pressure is released by well shutdown, reservoir, damage accumulates that can permanently reduce a well's future production capacity. Some wells, once shut down under these conditions, cannot be fully restored. Every day the blockade holds, Iran's long-term oil production capacity is being permanently reduced, compounding the economic damage of the term revenue loss with damage to the even after a deal is reached. Trump stated on Truth Social that Iran is losing $500 million per day. The IMF is signaling global economic slowdown due to oil markets are pricing for a prolonged blockade, while to every ceasefire tenov. The regime's physical manifestations on April 17th announced Defy. Foreign Minister İrgc announced Hormuz was open to all commercial vessels. On the diplomatic wing was attempting to signal flexibility to international partners ahead of the next round of nuclear negotiations on April 18th, with the U.S. blockade continuing to prevent ships from reaching Iranian ports. Iran closed the strait again. During the brief opening, 5 cruise ships and a handful of cargo vessels transited, then the lid. Open, closed, open, closed. Every country watching this cycle is drawing the same conclusion. Iran has lost the ability to execute a coherent strategy. It can either fight its way out of the blockade, cannot send a signal of de-escalation without the IRGC immediately contradicting that signal with live fire. It cannot sustain closure without the economic consequences accelerating toward a terminal point. It cannot survive. Hormuz was Iran's ultimate strategic weapon, the threat that kept the world nervous for 40 years, and it has become Iran's cage. The second pressure arriving from outside the country is perhaps the most diplomatically stunning development in this entire crisis. Because the pressure is not coming from Washington or Tel Aviv, it is coming from Beijing and Moscow. Xi Jinping called this Kremlitz Mohammed bin Salman and explicitly stated that the Strait of Hormuz must remain open to normal passage waterway in the common interest as in the international countries and the international community. Bloomberg reported this as the most explicit public stance she has taken on the strait. Read that carefully. China's leader called Saudi Arabia, not Iran, to deliver 25 years, not the country, with which China signed a comprehensive strategic partnership promising hundreds of billions in investment. Saudi Arabia, every Iranian security calculation, the country whose oil flows freely through Hormuz while Iran's sights locked behind the blockade. The signal embedded in that choice of interlocutor is precise. China is telling the region that its priority is the waterway, that Beijing's energy security, its yuan, trade strategy, its Gulf commercial for ships Iran's Gulf traction to grind Hormuz, regardless of what Tehran internal factions decide, and that China is willing to publicly align with Gulf states over Iran to make that priority clear. China's foreign ministry spokesperson followed with an explicit statement. Beijing purchased 90% safe and open. Beijing purchased 90% of Iran's oils before the blockade and used by strategic partnership with Iran promised infrastructure investment. Now China is publicly pressuring its own supplier to stop what it is doing because Chinese ships were being fired on by Iranian forces while simultaneously being seized by American forces, and Beijing cannot Pezeshkian and Galicum. China is indirectly strengthening Pezeshkian and Galibov, not because Beijing cares about Iranian political dynamics, because China's security currency strategy and Gulf commercial interests all point toward negotiation as the only acceptable outcome. Vahedi's war policies directly the Mayfighting, and China is no longer being quiet about interests. Russia's position is simultaneously more complex and more sinister. Foreign Minister Lavrov appeared at the Antalya Diplomacy Forum as unlawful in the same breath that he demanded guaranteed, unimpeded passage for Russian vessels through the strait. Iran accepted. Lavrov defended Iran's right to enrich uranium and offered Russia's continued support for whatever nuclear decision Iran chooses. And then Lavrov said something that stripped the performance of all ambiguity. Russia is ready to supply energy resources to China and other countries affected by the crisis. There it is. Russia's performing solidarity, its readiness to replace Iran in the energy markets Iran is losing. Every barrel of Iranian oil that cannot reach China because of the blockade is a barrel that Russia can sell to China, Russia at a price Iran can no longer contest because Iran is no longer in the market. Russia benefit the blockade holds and Iran's oil sits in full storage tanks with nowhere to go. Russia's support for Iran is the support who needs the close partnership narrative to remain credible while profiting from the partner's weakness. It is the same calculation that kept Russia Hormuz while Tehran was strangling itself with its own strategic weapon. The result is that Iran, at its most, with a heat-and-seared vulnerable moment, has achieved a geopolitical isolation that even its most determined enemies could not have. United States is the declared enemy. Alone now, states have been adversarial for decades. Gulf states have been adversarial for decades. And now China is publicly pressuring Iran to stand down. Russia is publicly Iran in the markets Iran is losing. The IRGC's proxy network, the 40-year infrastructure of regional power, projection that was the concrete expression of the revolution's reach, is collapsing simultaneously. Hezbollah's senior leadership has been eliminated. Hamas has been crushed in Gaza. The Houthis are in direct naval combat with American forces. The foundations of Iranian regional influence are eroding under sustained pressure from every direction at once. Vahedi either cannot see the strategic reality this creates or has decided that the IRGC's institutional position matters than much as a blockage inside. That calculation supplied Avim Matt from the negotiation delegation through the hardliner Mahmoud Nabavian, who was inserted into these Lamba talks to sabotage them from within, is driving Iran toward the one outcome no faction explicitly claims to want: total strategic collapse. At the center of the storm stands the most extraordinary detail in this entire crisis, the figure who would normally whose approval Ghalibaf is supposed to secure before making any strategic decision of consequence is an intensive care cannot communicate. Every decision Ghalibaf makes, every negotiating advances, every concession or condition attached to the talks, the authority of a component is being taken on, the authority of the Oma patient. The approval is imaginary. The mandate is invented. The entire constitutional architecture through which the Supreme Leader's authority channels downward through the system is operating on the fiction that Mojtaba Khamenei is aware and endorsing decisions being made in his name. For Vahedi, this creates an opportunity. Every decision Ghalibaf claims authorization for is challengeable. Every concession the negotiating claim be declared unauthorized. Every deal Iraqi signs can be repudiated by the IRGC on the grounds that no legitimate Supreme Leader approval was obtained. The country is not just a leadership vacuum. In Vahedi's hands, it is a perpetual veto mechanism that can be deployed retroactively against any outcome the hardliners dislike. Carefully and with full awareness of its implications, is Mossack counts Antoine drawings, is Mossack to 9 after Lenin's paralysis and death. Old comrades who had fought the same revolution together, who knew each other's files and failures from the founding years, began settling personal scores under the guise of ideological succession. The public framework was these revolutions' future. The private framework was 40 years of accumulated had competed for the same promotions, commanded the scheme units, filed charges against each other and watched each other's careers rise and fall through the same institutional Kermanshah in 1988. Rezai filed the charges. Military police made an arrest. Ghalibaf commanded one of those corps. Zulqadri Security Council, now Secretary General of the Superior. National Security Council was Vahedi's former superior. The roles have reversed. The grievances have not. What is playing out in Tehran is not a Politburo. It is, as one analyst put it with devastating precision, a nuclear-armed high school reunion, and the personal scores being settled inside that reunion are determining whether Iran negotiates its way out of this crisis or escalates into something that the region contains. Trump's ceasefire deadline arrives. Tomorrow, April 22nd, Vice President Vance has traveled to Islamabad. Theoretically scheduled, the second round of nuclear talks is. Theoretically, Iran has not confirmed whether it will participate. Inside the decision about participation is not being made by a unified government analyzing its options and selecting the most rational path forward. It is being contested between a president who publicly acknowledges a parliament speaker who viable, a parliament speaker who wants to negotiate while watching his back. 4. The knife Vahedi is sharpening, a foreign minister who has been called stupid on national television by his own side, a comatose supreme leader, but cannot be obtained, and an IRGC commander who views any deal as the beginning of the end of everything his institution has built. The 4 men running Iran have known each other since 1988. They know what each other's weaknesses, each other's figures, each other's ambitions, each other's files, and they are now playing the final game of a 40-year competition with the stakes. The welfare of 85 million a regime. The welfare of 85 million people and the stability of the most strategic, critical waterway on Earth. Galibaf asks whether he can purge Vahedi through the assembly the next tank him first. Vahedi asks whether the next tanker he fires on will be the one that eliminates the Islamabad talks entirely, and political position inside the regime. Pezeshkian asks whether telling the truthies to the Iranian people will buy the regime enough legitimacy to survive, or whether the truth itself will escalate this collapse he is trying to prevent, and the people, 63% of whom say this war, ask the question that no faction inside the regime has a comfortable answer to. How much longer must we wait? Here is what the world outside Tehran is watching for in days ahead. If Galibaf's faction can consolidate enough institutional authority to keep the Islamabad talks alive, if İrgc can survive being called stupid long enough to deliver a framework, if the IRGC's sabotage campaign can be contained before Vahedi to destroy enough, if there is a path to a deal. Not an elegant deal, not a deal that resolves every dimension of the conflict, but a deal that stops the oil clock before the wells have to shut down, that provides enough economic relief to prevent the domestic uprising that Galibaf sees coming and İrgc, and that gives everyone on all sides enough to claim survival. If Vahedi wins this internal war, if he successfully topples Galibaf before a second round of talks can produce a framework, if the IRGC's war monopoly reasserts itself over the civilian faction of survival calculation, there's a different path. Escalation that nobody fully controls, a strait that cannot open because the factions capable of opening it have been neutralized. An economic collapse takes the regime faster than any military operation could, and a regional conflagration its proxy pressuring it to stops. Its proxy networks already collapsing, its oil wells beginning to go dark, and four men from 1988 settling personal scores in a room while the Contras around see. The United States is watching, China is watching. From the side of the Gulf states, rather than the side just Russia is watching while preparing to fill the oil market Iran is losing. An 85 propaganda claim 87% war support, while knowing, in a number that independent researchers have documented, that 63% of them say this war was never theirs to begin with. The Strait of Hormuz opened for 5 cruise ships and closed again. The oil wells have 10 to 15 days. The deadline is supposed to make the final decision cannot open his eyes, and the 4 men from the barracks of 1988 are running out of time to decide whether they will save the regime or destroy it. He wants to preserve what the regime built for the IRGC regardless of the cost to everything else. His name's Vahedi. His name's Vahedi. He has a record stretching from Lebanon to Buenos Aires. He commands the force that is firing on tankers while the foreign minister announces arrives. And the world asks whether Iran is coming to the table. It will be his calculation more than anyone else's that provides the answer. The chaos is real. The collapse is accelerating. And the man with interest in negotiation, that is what has stunned Washington. The collapse has stunned Washington. Not the crisis itself, but the man at the center of it.